Geopolitics and Diplomacy is a project promoting educational, analytical, and objective conversations over a range of topics from energy, technology, security, peace, conflict, and of course, geopolitics and diplomacy. On this channel, we try to bring in experts from think tanks, academia, and the world of corporates. We hope you like and subscribe our channel for our best in class commentary and conversations. I'm Aishwaria Sonavane, journalist and geopolitical analyst. Uh, Hello. Today, me and Danish will try to unpack China's diligent expansion and growing influence in the South Asian region. As neighbors of China, these countries, including Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and the smaller states, have been increasingly engaging with Beijing in various domains of diplomacy, economy, and security. Uh, Allow me to expand on that last bit a little. While China is actively expanding, it faces immediate threats to its strategic and financial interests in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and not just Islamist groups, but also separatist outfits. The Islamic State Khorasan province, which operates in the Afghanistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province of Pakistan, has sort of paced up its anti-China rhetoric and propaganda uh, in the past few months. Very recently, in fact, in December 2022 and January this year, the Islamic State, which is also the prime rival of the Afghan Taliban, uh, launched high profile attacks in central Kabul, which were intended to target Chinese nationals and subsequently hinder their engagement with the Taliban. The Turkestan Islamic Party, an anti China group which is dominated by the Uyghur Muslims, has also revived its online propaganda against China. Um, and it's building its network and collaboration with other outfits in the AFPAC region. Um, this was recorded in a recent UNSC report. So these attacks come at a time when China is looking for a greater role in Afghanistan. A Beijing-owned Chinese company recently signed a contract with the Taliban to develop an oil reserve in the Saripul province of Afghanistan. However, an unstable and volatile Afghanistan threatens China's interests um, and will only protract Beijing's very ambitious Belt and Road Initiative in the region. Um, Mind you, these threats are not exclusive to just Afghanistan, but also in Pakistan, where the Baloch and Sindh insurgent groups have been targeting Chinese nationals and China and Pakistan economic project, the CPEC interests. We've seen attacks in Karachi. We saw a suicide attack by an educated uh, female bomber of the Balochistan Liberation Army last year in April. So this sort of provides an insight into how the anti-China sentiment runs through a broader demography in the Baloch community. Um, so the current internal security threats in Pakistan, which is caused by the sudden proliferation of the TTP or the Pakistani Taliban, um, it has somehow also provided an impetus. It's emboldened these insurgent groups uh, who have long-standing hostilities and anti-China sentiments, for they oppose China's investments in their territory. Um, Speaking of the Islamist threat, the persecution of the Uyghur Muslim community in the Xinjiang province has also sort of resonated in the extremist circles. And for its foreign policy and economic imperatives, Pakistan has periodically overlooked the persecution of the Uyghur community. Uh, See, it's quite straightforward. It is not in Pakistan's interests to discuss issues pertaining to China, or its all-weather friend, as Islamabad refers to Beijing. Uh, so broadly, based on the combination of everything that I've mentioned, uh, I foresee a sustained militancy-related challenge for China, especially in near its western borders in the coming months. Uh, Danish, moving on from the security challenges from a very volatile neighborhood, uh, How do you place China's diplomatic and political interests with other smaller South Asian regions?
So, Ash, the first up, you've summed it up so well in the western peripheries of China. You've killed all my chances today of trying to sound smarter than you. But anyway, I'll try to pretend as hard as I can. Um, Look, I think uh, it's been more than a year since this wonderful paper by Dr. Deep Pal. He was writing for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Then he, last I checked, he's not associated with them anymore. Uh, but the entire paper talks about these emerging, peripheral democracies, of, if I can call them that, these emerging small countries in the peripheries of South Asia, Bangladesh, uh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Maldives. All of these countries are emerging democracies with inherent problems that emerging democracies often have. And Deep Pal, in his wonderfully written paper and very well articulated, um, he points to three areas where there could be possible vulnerabilities in these countries. One is brittle institutions. The second area is a virtually non-existent civil society or irrelevant civil society. And the third one is elite capture. Now, all of us have always seen China as this massive behemoth which uses its military force or brick and mortar infrastructure, as we, we've all been obsessing over the BRI. But here's this wonderful scholar who has actually thrown light on how uh, the Chinese are actually much more subtle, much more. The Chinese approach is much more subtle and much more nuanced than just brick and mortar infrastructure and militaristic might, as these three areas broadly demonstrate. Now, what happens when there are brittle uh, democratic institutions in these countries? It opens the countries up, at least at the middle bureaucratic level, to Chinese corruption, kickbacks, and they are able to have their way in policy making, in even in administration to some extent in these countries. Likewise, when civil society is non-existent in these countries, there's no external mechanism to put these checks and balances on the system overall. It also involves media houses, and there are actually instances of Chinese investment in these media houses, newspapers, creation entities, all of these upcoming news agencies, with Chinese backing, they have to peddle the Chinese narrative within these countries, project a positive image of China within their own countries, and likewise with respect to the elite capture, as we saw in Rajapaksa's Sri Lanka, we saw that Chinese were able to have their way, especially with massive infrastructure projects like ports, because the elites were, in a way captured. The Rajapaksa government elites were captured by the Chinese. Um, this has been, and interestingly, the paper also cites how the Chinese, even in procedural democracies, all of these are procedural democracies where proper elections happen. Even in the case of these procedural democracies, very cleverly the Chinese companies orchestrate the projects in such a way that the project completion date is very closely aligned with the election date. So you can only imagine the kind of goodwill that the incumbent governments are able to generate right before the elections happen. So although they're not, using brute force or trying to influence the elections directly, somewhere in the back alleys of this entire procedural democratic process, they are able to very significantly influence the result of these elections. So, like I said, for a very long time, this notion of this Chinese brick and mortar and military might, has been peddled, but there's very little attention being given to these more nuanced, diplomatic and strategic attempts by the Chinese, especially in these small, vulnerable democracies in and around South Asia.
Right. So could you elaborate on the part where you said China is using its soft power to engage with these regions? Could you tell us how exactly this is happening, or what are different ways that China employs?
Right. So for a very long time, the Chinese have seen themselves, traditionally, the Chinese have seen themselves as the Middle Kingdom, or as the word Zhonggu. I don't know how what the Chinese pronunciation is. I don't pride myself on my Chinese, but it roughly translates to the Middle Kingdom, and in English. And when you are the Middle Kingdom, the rest of the world comes to you. The rest of the world comes to you, pays tribute to you. You're the center of the universe, of the political universe, at least. And for traditionally, Chinese have had this superiority complex. The Chinese psyche has had this superiority complex, the highly cultured sort of an outlook, perception of themselves, the highly cultured, highly civilized self-image that they've always believed in, and that has actually, projected a notion that the Chinese are unwilling to open up. Now, since 1970s, since the whole Deng Xiaoping transformation took place, the economy is opened. Since the 1970s, there has been a massive change in this in this approach from the Chinese. The Chinese have suddenly opened up. They are more open to the world. More people in China are learning English. More people in Chinese peripheries, in the immediate Chinese neighborhood, both in the East as well as the West, are learning the Chinese language in Pakistan, including in Pakistan. The idea, the long term idea, of course, is different. The Chinese see themselves as this economic engine, and that economic engine needs a lot of human resources, which will be pulled in, which will be sucked in from these peripheries, and they have to learn the Chinese language as a result. So, but overall, the Chinese have opened up. The Chinese have culturally tried to open up. Last few years, there have been widespread crackdowns on these Confucius institutes across Europe and even in the U.S. Now, what are these Confucius institutes? These institutes are believed to be propaganda institutes. The governments across Europe and the West in general are trying to clamp down on them, because they believe that the Chinese are trying to influence their students, young minds, to believe in the Chinese way of thinking, Chinese outlook towards the world, which is to a great extent true. Uh, these days, politicians, nations, corporations want to be a part of narratives, want to be a part of a bigger, larger than life story. And China, as a nation, as a civilization, also wants to peddle its own narrative, wants to set its own narrative. For a very long time, they've been at the receiving end of the Western narrative, the US narrative, all of us. But now China, if China wants to be the next superpower, it has to be a part of a bigger, larger than itself, larger than life narrative, which it is doing through the institutions like the Confucius Institutes. Now, why is this significant? uh, for a very long time, the Western scholars and the Western intelligentsia, the academia in the West, they have not been able to understand um, the Chinese psyche, because uh, a lot of scholars in the West had predicted that once the economy opens up, after what happened in the 1970s, the economy opened up. It is a communist country only in name, only politically, not economically anymore. Once the economy opened up, many Western scholars had predicted that the same changes that took place in Chinese economics are going to translate into Chinese politics in or around the year 2016. That has not happened, and it has confused a lot of them as to why the Chinese political system is not budging to this open sort of economic, uh, this entire open economic discourse, which should have been by now also translated into their political system. And only recently, the Western scholars, Western academia, have been able to point a finger to the Chinese value system, to the Confucius value system, which forms a very bedrock of China as a civilizational force. I can't say for sure, but only recently I was listening to a podcast where a young Chinese student was talking about how there is simply no directly translatable word for freedom in Chinese language. Freedom has no directly translatable. There's no directly translatable word for freedom in the Chinese language, which shows a lot about which shows a lot about the Chinese outlook towards society in general, Chinese philosophy of life. It is more rooted in loyalty. It is more rooted in the ideas of hierarchy, bureaucracy, Mandarin, the Mandarin where our own word for Hindi word for mantri comes from. It is a Chinese word. It says a great deal about how Chinese society in general has been steeped into these values of hierarchy, structures, social loyalties, rather than individual freedoms that the West would like to have them believe. So to actually to actually promote this counter narrative, this different outlook towards world in general, Chinese have to be actively promoting their own, their own literature, their own value system through mechanisms like the Confucius Institutes, or through media, or by learning English, which is now, safely can be said to be the global language, although not in terms of the population, but in terms of the spread, probably in terms of trade, commerce, media. The World Wide Web is in the English language. So I think that's the approach, and that's the whole idea behind trying to project your own story, trying to project your own narrative in the world today.
Yeah. So when you say the Chinese community, I would like to specify that it is the majority, the Han ethnicity
Yes.
of the Chinese community. Thank you so much for that, Danish. While we've elaborated on China's soft power engagements in the region, what are your thoughts on Beijing's hard power, which is more visible in the international system, especially in the mainstream media and in the context of the West versus China narrative?
Yes, I think very visible, no holds barred. They make no bones about the fact that they have the might. I put out a tweet recently about this Xi Jinping's massive white diaper floating over the US. How many people can do that? I don't think a lot of countries can afford to do that after the Cold War. Even during the Cold War, I don't think a lot of such instances took place. Openly provocative. Then, of course, sending their Air Force, or doing drills around Taiwan, which is going to be potentially the next major flashpoint, providing backing to the Russians in the Ukraine war. I think all of this suggests that Chinese are bold enough to actually showcase their might, make a show of strength in different ways. They won't shy away from taking the West taking the Western bull by its horns. So I think, yeah, it reminds me of Woodrow Wilson's quote, have a smile on your face, something to that effect. I won't be able to quote him verbatim, but have a big smile on your mouth, but always carry a stick with you. So I think that really is, they've taken a leaf out of Wilson's book there.
Yeah, if it also seems like China is ready to take the lead on the anti-West front with its current engagements with Iran and all the so so that's happening. China is definitely putting it up on the world stage to be like a counter narrative and a counter regime to the West.
Yes.
Coming back to our region, we see US has started to rely very heavily on India. Washington's interests to control China's advances in the Indian subcontinent sort of aligns with New Delhi's competition for influence with Beijing in South Asia. Uh, how do you see the relationship between India and China unfolding in the coming period?
I think a very interesting dynamic emerging, and I'll tell you why. The US sees India as a big part of this larger strategic puzzle in the region. India is a country with comparable, if not an economy at par with the Chinese. It has the numbers, it has the size, it has the military wherewithal, it has, most importantly, a nuclear deterrent. All of these benefits do not come with US alliance with Japan, South Korea, or Australia deep down into the Pacific. It is only India that can provide this kind of wherewithal as a bulwark against the Chinese. But the interesting part is India acknowledges this fact. India knows that it is important to the West, but at the same time, it is unwilling to be played off against the Chinese, as it was amply demonstrated recently. India held its own when the war against Ukraine started. India did not toe the Western line. India was unwilling to do that very openly, very defiantly. And India, with respect to China, understands that this is a country that has problems with India. India and China have a lot of problems. There are lots of conflicts, territorial especially. But both countries, India and China, they have been successful in walking that tightrope and dehyphenating the conflicts with economic partnership, dehyphenating conflicts with trade, especially. India sees China as a rich source of investment nearby, especially for its startups in these emerging sectors, IT, electronics. India is an economy which has traditionally been capital strapped, and China could be a great source of capital investments. Likewise, China sees India as this mammoth middle class market right nearby, which makes all the logistical sense for the Chinese for its affordable electronics and other exports. So India and China have been able to successfully dehyphenate the conflicts from areas of cooperation. Now, how has this? There's one more factor that has acted in a way that it has acted as a blessing in disguise, which is the language barrier. What we see between India and Pakistan, the same common languages, Hindi or Urdu, the media kicks in, the TRP-driven media kicks in and mobilizes the public opinion both in both the countries, India and Pakistan. The TRP-driven media mobilizes public opinion against the other country. This is not happening between India and China, primarily because of the language barrier. We don't understand what the Chinese are saying. They don't understand what we are saying, and across the Himalayas down here. So that media rhetoric is somewhat muffled when it comes to China, and hence the public opinion is not mobilized as much as it happens with the other neighbor. So I think it's a very interesting. It makes for a great, interesting commentary, in my opinion. I have been glued to the developments between the two nations in the recent times. So I think, yeah, it's very balanced, and it is the credit has to be given to both the countries in how they have been able to balance it very well.
Yeah, I remember we had this conversation about how the propaganda with India, China was restricted, especially in the Indian media that we saw, and the Chinese media because of the language barrier.
Yes, absolutely. So also because
Yeah.
China, the public opinion does matter for India a great deal,
Mhm.
and it might not matter so much in China because it's a one-party system. The democracy, it's not a democracy technically, and therefore I mean, I'm not trying to condone the Chinese here, the Chinese system here. I'm always in all for democracy, 100%. But what China brings to the table is the fact that China has a very limited coterie right right high up in the government. Quite a few people in the around Xi Jinping who take the most important strategic decisions, diplomatic decisions. And as a result, China has an unparalleled ability to make sharp policy maneuvers as and when it decides to do that. This is unparalleled across the world for a country of its size, for a huge country. The US doesn't have that kind of ability, because the Chinese involvement, there's very little involvement of the population of any. There are no rival political parties. It's a one party system, and even within that party system, there's a small coterie of people who can take um, you know unprecedented decisions, who can take surprise decisions, who can make sharp policy maneuvers, especially with respect to their immediate neighborhood.
Yeah, China's it's politically homogeneous, and we saw in the Chinese Communist Party Congress as well this year that the Politburo is comprises of all of Xi Jinping's loyalists. So I think what you said, we'll see more of that in the coming period. Uh, Thank you so much, Danish, for your contribution. I hope our viewers also find this interaction as rewarding as we do. Please let us know what you think of our video, and share topics if you want us to cover in the next video. Thank you so much, Danish.
Thank you so
It's
much, Ash.
always a pleasure to speak to
Have
you.
a great weekend. Take care.
You too. Have a great day.
Bye bye.
you know, I